May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Tell the story. You've heard me say this before. Tell the story. It's what the world needs to hear. Anything I say when preaching, any thoughts you might have as you ponder, put that all aside when you pass on the story and tell it just as it is. Otherwise, the danger is that you'll create a fog, and the fog is what will be remembered. So let's tell the story and try not to add too much to it. Jesus had three friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. We've met them before in St. Luke's Gospel. Mary had sat at Jesus' feet, entranced by the wonder of his words, while Martha prepared the meal. Mary was not at all impressed with that, and Lazarus was not on the scene. That's not the story as we find it in St. John. That's not the story. This one seems to be later. Lazarus is with them now. Perhaps he was a widower, now come to live with his sisters, or perhaps he had some chronic illness and was no longer able to live on his own. Whatever the reason, by the time we come to this story, Lazarus had died. Mary and Martha were distraught, and they felt let down by their friend. And Jesus, for it was he, Jesus was equally distressed. Those two words are the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. His grief was real, and we need to note that. He knew what he was going to do, so why should he weep? We're not told. We can only speculate. Perhaps because the darkness had reached out and blighted the life of this little family. Perhaps because it reminded him of the death that he knew that he was going to face himself in Jerusalem in just a few days' time. Or possibly it's been suggested that even if he did raise Lazarus from the dead, it wouldn't end well. Not simply because, of course, Lazarus would be bound to die again sooner or later, but because the previous miracle he'd performed, the healing of the blind man, had been very badly received by everyone except the blind man himself. Only a few verses after the raising of Lazarus, we hear the high priest announcing that enough is enough. It's better that Jesus should be put to death than that people should have to tolerate such goings on in their midst. We're told there was a great number there to witness Lazarus' return to life, and they told. So there's the story with a few added points that you should probably forget. And the fog, I said, one creates, well, it's already begun to gather, perhaps, as it always does. So let it come, if only so we can dispel it again. The question I ask, the question we have to ask, is what does this story mean for us? Why do we trouble people with telling it in the 21st century? Because we know we can't expect it to happen in our own days. None of us has been given the hope or the promise that we will be miraculously brought back from the dead there and then, 2 or 3 days after we've died. None of us should be encouraged to pray that one of our lost ones will come back and join us. That has never been promised to us. And unless you read the sensational accounts of recovery in the tabloid press, and perhaps want to qualify your definition of what death actually is, this kind of thing hasn't happened again ever since. There are so many questions you'd want to ask about it, and not a single one of them can be answered. Was it an extreme healing miracle? Was it a reversal of the laws of biochemistry, which I suppose is the same thing? Or was it a miracle of some kind, a miracle of space and time? How could you even begin to answer that question? We don't have any more evidence, anything more to go on than the words we've heard in the Gospel. So what are you going to say to someone who's skeptical about it, who says they're not going to bother with a religion that requires belief in such impossible things? Well, the first thing I'll say, and I'm aware this will sound a little strange, the first thing is that this miracle was not performed for our benefit. It wasn't performed for us. Blessed are they who have not seen and yet have believed, Jesus said. And that refers to us. Those who saw, back in those days, those who saw did believe, and all credit to them, of course. But perhaps it's not so difficult to be impressed by something that happened in front of your own eyes. That's the point. No one in those days, no one suggested that it didn't happen or that there was any kind of trickery. They were more perplexed by what to make of it. What to make of it? Well, that question, that narrow question, at least, is quite easy for us to answer. Go back to the early stories of healings at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Where Jesus was present, the kingdom of God was present in its fullness. Illness and sorrow just could not exist. Where Jesus was present, where the kingdom was present in its fullness, death could not exist. The miracles, or signs, as they're called in St. John's Gospel, the signs were done so that the glory of God might be revealed to those who were there witnessing it. They could see that the kingdom of heaven was already there working amongst them. We can't imagine that ourselves. But it was because they witnessed and they believed then. It was because those who believed eventually went on to spread the news throughout the world and be crucified in their turn because of their conviction, because of their faith. That brought the church into being, and that's why we are still here passing on the story. Their witness back then. What the very first Christians believed after the generation of those eyewitnesses, what they believed was actually very much less than all that. Paul's followers in Rome and Corinth and Thessalonica, they didn't have the Gospels. Those stories were still circulating orally. They hadn't been collected together. What they had to go on was what they'd heard from Paul and from others. They didn't know probably about the miracles. They knew little more than that Christ had himself returned from the dead. For them, that was in itself enough. What we believe, on the other hand, what we believe is set down in the creed we say every Sunday. We say, I believe in God, or we believe in God, if you don't want to take responsibility for quite everything and get your neighbour to shoulder some of it. We believe in God. And if someone says, well, I can believe in so much, but I can't believe really in those miracles, they say you couldn't ask us really to believe this because it's clearly impossible. Well, if they say that to you, as sometimes people do, well, don't engage with that. Just remind yourself quietly that with God nothing is impossible. Murmur to them something about the Apostles' Creed. You're sure you've got a copy somewhere. And move back onto ground they find more comfortable. There's a big point here that I'm just going to mention briefly once and come back to it another time. Mark this. Faith isn't an achievement of our own. Faith is a gift. Never ever try to increase someone's faith by arguing with them or trying to persuade them, because that's not how faith arrives. But that's for another sermon. To conclude, the raising of Lazarus is an acted parable. It's like a story that's been acted out in front of people so that they can see what the meaning concealed in the action is. That is that death is not the end. That's what they were being told. Death is not the end. And here is something for you to see to make the point. Death is not the end, they were told. Believe that, and you'll come through. The same is true for us. Now let the fog disperse. Tell the story. Don't cloud it with the fog. Tell the story because it's what the world needs to hear. Tell the story. Keep faith with the God who keeps faith with us. Do that, and you've done everything.